The Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest in the world, and we just happen to live in them. One thing we can tell you, there are ghosts in the mountains.
Good evening and welcome to another episode of Ghosts in the Mountains. I am your host, Caleb Hanks, as always, and I am with my good friend and co-host, you may have heard of him, he's not a doctor, Austin Burgess. Austin, how are you this fine evening, my friend?
I'm doing pretty well tonight, man. How are you doing?
Brother, I've got an itch I can't scratch, but the good news is there's somebody that's going to scratch that itch for me. And as weird as that sounds, I am incredibly excited to tell the listeners of Ghosts in the Mountains that we have a special show for you tonight because we're going to be talking about a much requested topic. We're coming back to a much requested topic. We are actually going to be talking tonight about the legendary Sasquatch. And there would not be anybody else in this world who could shed more light on the actual possibility of Sasquatch existing, and that is none other
than Sasquatch.
Than Sasquatch himself. Just kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight joining us, my favorite researcher out there, Dr. Lauren Coleman. How are you, Lauren?
It's wonderful to be here.
I almost said Stephen Greer again, but I didn't want to do that one. Ladies and gentlemen, he's almost a staple here at this podcast.
I feel like it's like every 10 episodes we bring Micah back.
Yeah, we got to. Ladies and gentlemen, Micah Hanks, how are you tonight?
I am here in your domain yet again. I have invaded, although it is a silent and soft invasion.
Yes.
My code name tonight is Boogeyman733. Our safe word is green grass and high tides. This one goes out to the infamous Dr. Lexo, wherever he may be, and it's always good to be back with you.
Well, he's probably out there somewhere with Gerald the Potato Goblin. So, Micah, dude, all right, number one, so glad that you're back here in the studio. I know that if the three of us are together and there's a roadcaster running, we're going to have a good time. And this is a subject that you have never talked about on this podcast with us. We've had you cover everything from ghost goblins to UFOs, and now we're finally getting down to grass tacks.
Well, I've never talked about goblins, just to be clear.
Shut up. This is my show. If I say you talked about goblins, you did. But tonight, we have brought you on because me and Austin are too lazy to put together our own damn show prep. And secondarily, we really want to talk about the possibility and the feasibility that Sasquatch potentially actually is real. And I, again, am so blessed to have a brother that has gone into so many different subjects when it comes to paranormal stuff. But dude, you have done, insane amounts of research when it comes to the study of there being something to this Bigfoot cryptid phenomenon. A lot of people go out in the woods and they run a camera and they go, "What was that? What was that?" But Micah has done the research, he's done the reading, he's looked into every avenue that he possibly could to figure out, is there some truth to this outside of just the reports that we've gotten from people all over the planet about this thing. And man, I'm always excited every single time that you and I just personally get together and talk about this stuff. But I want this to be just a fun conversation about the potential of this, but also, dude, you have so much knowledge about this. Just at first glance in 2025, like, what is your perspective on the Sasquatch phenomenon? I mean, you have a podcast called Sasquatch Tracks.
Yeah, after studying this for a long time, I'm, comfortable coming out tonight. In fact, this is sort of a what you might call a coming out party. I'm going to be announcing tonight my skepticism, and I don't believe there is a Sasquatch, but I've studied this stuff for a long time. We can talk about the myth and the folklore and, how people believe in silly things, but I don't buy it, no.
Well, you heard it here first, guys. All right, well, thank you so much for listening to Ghosts in the Mountains. Here's the theme song again, Kiss My Ass. Just kidding.
I'm totally kidding, by the way. No, again, I think that the logical conclusion a lot of people come to is, well, it seems like a cool idea. It would be fun to think that there's a great big hairy ape running around out there, but logically I cannot draw this conclusion. And again, I think that there's some logic to, there's some basis for that skeptical attitude. But, again, for me, I look at a lot of these seemingly implausible things, and rather than saying, well, the easiest and therefore the most defensible and probably the most scientifically safe and credible position. Again, credible in terms of if you want to make sure that the broader scientific community takes you seriously and they, you're using the right code language to always broadcast to people who you're trying to impress that you're safe and that you're not crazy. Yeah, the most respectable, defensible position and easiest, frankly, is just to say, I'm a Sasquatch skeptic. To me, a true skeptic would say, let's really look at what the data says and let's see if there is a there. And what I've actually determined personally about Sasquatch is a lot of the data that people lean on heavily as the basis for why this creature exists is probably less convincing than they realize. But there's also a tremendous amount of historical data that to me suggests that there's something more to this than the skeptics have, again, maybe pre-concluded. I think that there's this sort of premature conclusion that, well, it seems crazy, therefore it is, therefore I don't believe. Looking at the historical record at least suggests that at one time there was something like Sasquatch. But then we get into some of the discussions I've had with park rangers, and in recent decades, things that they say they've seen. So again, the body of evidence to me, while not conclusive, strongly is suggestive that there could be more to this than a lot of people are aware.
Well, Dr. Burgess, who is not a doctor, and I'm going to probably stop calling you that soon so there's no confusion. You and I have done our episode about Bigfoot, the Bigfoot of Madison County. That was a very, very small, flashlight in the dark of the entire subject.
Yes.
But it was illuminating to some potential, at least reports of Sasquatch stuff here in our area. Now, before we did that episode, obviously, you knew of Sasquatch, you were versed in reports of that stuff. So, I mean, like going into it in 2025 and after we've done this episode, like what is your outlook on this whole thing at this point?
So for me, I think with the Madison County episode, that was very much like taking a phenomenon such as like the Bigfoot or Sasquatch and almost looking at it in a microcosm, looking at maybe potential sightings or occurrences or some patterns that have happened, particularly in this one county in Western North Carolina. And to my surprise, we found quite a bit more than I expected to in that one kind of general area.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that there's a lot of concepts that, we kind of touched on in that episode, some of the concepts of wild men and the confusion between that and some of the Sasquatch. But, admittedly, this is a topic that I'm probably not as well versed on as you are, just knowing your kind of history with the legendary Sasquatch book that was split back in the day too. So,
well, yeah, my knowledge of the subject, meaning I've sat in a room while Micah has talked about it many, many times, and honestly, just like peripherally, I would never call myself an authority on the matter. And my personal outlook towards the Sasquatch phenomenon is always just kind of like a hopeful one in the regard of, there's a lot of people out there that seem to have witnessed this firsthand. I would like to think that there is a little bit of wonder left in the world. But I will say that, the times that I have talked with Micah at length about, the potential evidence of there being an actual physical bipedal ape-like creature walking around on planet Earth, it's always left me with kind of this scratching my head kind of thought of like, it always seems weird when you have an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims always have to have extraordinary evidence. So it does bring up the questions. Why don't we ever find a skeleton? What about droppings? What about evidence other than footprints and that sort of stuff? And I think that those are the main questions that kind of come to people's minds. Now, again, I will say that I am hopeful that there is something more to this, because I would like to think that a vast majority of these people that are claiming to see this are not just lying or delusional or whatever that is.
Yeah, I think when you have that many sightings, that's almost a validating data point in itself.
Yeah.
I think that there's certainly a fair share of misidentifications and maybe some sensationalism going on with some of those. But for the thousands of reports that there are for every single one of them to be a case of that, it just seems unlikely.
I agree. And especially when talking to the bro, Micah, you have told me so many times about people who are very, very credible. If you're going to at least entertain the idea that Sasquatch exists at all in some places where you're like, well, if it were going to exist, yeah, I think that maybe this could be a place where they could. You've told me some stories, maybe some stuff going on around places like the Yellowstone Thoroughfare and things like that. So, man, let's just take a look at this thing, and you can start wherever you want, but I think that I do want to intentionally address some of the things that we have talked about before, and we can get to this at whatever point. But I do think that one of the things that I always found interesting was the whole question of, why don't you ever find a skeleton?
Well, let's actually start right there.
Okay, cool.
Let's look at some issues that we have with easy acceptance of the idea of Sasquatch, and let's look at this rationally, look at the pros and the cons. Let's see if there's an argument we can build for the existence of a creature like this. And then let's look back in time, both at the paleoanthropological record and why I think that there's a strong case to be made that there is, again, a anthropological reality that can be considered here, and then bring that all the way up to near recent history and look at really if there's a deeper perspective on this that historically suggests that prior to the common acceptance of the Sasquatch or Bigfoot archetype, which really doesn't emerge until starting, if we consider Sasquatch and Bigfoot the same thing, and that's a discussion we'll have too, but that starts to begin in the 20s, really comes to fruition by the 1950s and 60s, reaches critical mass in the American media by the 1970s. Many have tried to make an argument that there was no knowledge of an idea of a thing like a Bigfoot or a large hairy ape prior to that. But in fact, the historical record might suggest otherwise. So that's the kind of progression I want to follow. We'll start with a body. So I often wonder the same thing. Why don't we find a body if this is a creature that exists? Now, I'm a person who has spent a lot of time in the forests throughout North America. And frankly, I've actually spent a lot of time in forests in other parts of the world too. In South America, I've spent some time in Portuguese territory, in the forests on the Azores, in the middle of the Atlantic. I've spent time in the plains and the forests of Canada, although that's North America, but it's another country. I mean, my point is I've traveled a good bit. I've actually been in some fairly remote parts of Middle America and Mexico and, Mayan ruins and things along those lines. And
they've talked about seeing them down there as well.
I've seen a diverse array of different kinds of biology that our planet has to offer. I've seen some rare animals. One of the rarest animals I think I've ever personally beheld, and anybody out there listening who knows what a pine marten is and you happen to know how rare those are, I've seen one in broad daylight. I was not alone when I saw that. Tom Godleski, a good friend of ours, was with us when we saw that pine marten, and so you could talk. In fact, Tom and his family are very intrigued by the lore in this region, and we could maybe talk to them sometime. And they've reached out to us a few times recently. But Tom was right there with me when we saw that pine marten. And again, what I'm pointing out is that there are animals that are naturally very wary. They're very good at hiding.
Tigers are massive creatures, and they are very, very good at hiding. I think we've talked about before how there was a group that had set up trail cams all over the territory where they are more than likely, they are a bit nomadic, they move around. That's a huge ass animal, and it took them 3 years to get it on a trail cam. I could be wrong about that, but I'm fairly certain that it was 3 years.
No, you're probably right. And in fact, there was a similar study done with grizzly bears in the out west, and this was probably in Wyoming. And in fact, it may have been John Mayenzinski, whose story is very interesting, and we will touch on that too when we get into the government side of this, because unlike a lot of researchers, think something that's fairly unique about my approach is I went from the history and the biology over into the governmental side of this, and I said, I'm going to use Public Record Act and Freedom of Information Act requests to see if I can appeal to the government for any information they may have on this, and I've actually found some stuff. So,
right,
that all said, there was a former government employee, John Mayenzinski, who was telling me about a study that they did with grizzly bears, and they set up cameras and did the whole thing. In 3 years, they filmed 0 grizzly bears.
Damn.
0.
They should have talked to Timothy Treadwell.
Well, the thing is people who know how to find these animals and go to look, or if you just have dumb luck like me and you're going up the Skalkaho Pass in Montana and you see a pine marten run across the road, you're in the right place at the right time. Sasquatch sightings tend to be the same. And yet we still don't have a body, but we do find dead bear. People will say, you'll never find a dead bear laying by the side of the road. On at least 3 occasions I have. Caleb and I have seen wild boar laying by the side of the road.
At this point, it's very easy to see a dead black bear on the side of the road, especially up here, because the change in the temperature over the last few years, and I say few, but the change in temperature has really made the bear population explode. And I think another thing about that as well.
Well, they're habituating.
Yeah.
They're getting used to humans.
But I think that there was also, for a time, there was a little bit of a constraint on how many you could actually kill. So bear population is legitimately out of control here.
Yeah, and the fact that there are more of them, again, leads to more, road killings, and we see plenty of deer and other animals like that. So although it is a problem, obviously, and I'm going to admit that, the skeptic in me says the fact that we don't have Sasquatch roadkills could be interpreted in a few ways. One way would be they don't exist. One would be there are very few of these, and maybe they don't operate in areas that are near roadways. But then again, we should still imagine that in some instances, hunters or others will have found bodies. Now, intriguingly, there are anecdotal accounts where hunters claim that they've shot them, observed the bodies, that remains have been found. The problem is those are anecdotal stories. There's never been any kind of physical evidence. And so, in fact, this prompted me to reach out to officials at Yellowstone Park, and I just said, do you have any sightings out there? And their response was pretty telling. They said, we have no confirmed sightings of this animal in the park, and therefore, with no confirmed sightings, we don't have any kind of plans or procedures or any, inclination to want to prepare for the eventuality of its discovery. Now, obviously, the people who are responding to me, they're like, God, these Sasquatch people, those guys, they didn't want to hear this. But I mean, I'm listening to what they said, and I read into it, and I thought that's interesting because they said no confirmed sightings. What is a confirmed sighting? Most people would make no distinction between confirmed and sighting.
Sure.
A confirmed sighting of like a large cat, a panthera, one of the species of the, pumas or the mountain lions that exist in North America.
Baby stealers. 3
varieties, by the way, the western cougar, the eastern cougar, which is now presumed extinct, but there are still sightings in the eastern United States of these animals. And then there's the Florida panther. And there are morphological differences, mostly that come down to head size, but those 3 species are the ones that are known, one presumed extinct. Those animals, for there to be a confirmed sighting, there would have to be footprints, or there would have to be photographs, or there would have to be DNA. For instance, if there's an animal kill, they would actually be able to go and take a test. They would find saliva, blood, something else, some DNA that proves that animal has been there. And so when it comes to Sasquatch, first of all, we could find footprints of a Sasquatch, but it still wouldn't be a confirmed sighting by that definition because we don't have any kind of a type specimen that says this is what this creature is, this is what it looks like, these are the morphological characteristics, here's what its foot appears to look like.
Right.
And even if we find a large human-looking foot in a national park,
that could be a basketball player.
Or it could be a hoax. And so there is no established, we have the type specimen, the species is established as existent. And therefore we know that when we see the sign of the creature, it's been here. Very different story than, a mountain lion, even as implausible it seems to some to find like a eastern cougar somewhere. You could find evidence of one. You could prove that.
Sure.
We can't prove something that is not yet confirmed to exist. So that's one of the issues with Sasquatch. So where's that body? That's a huge problem. And so in my opinion, we have to interpret that as either meaning that there isn't a creature, they do not typically die in the places where humans find them, or they operate in areas where humans typically do not go, and that would also account for why there aren't the road killings, right? So where I come down on that is it's not implausible to me that there could be a reality to Sasquatch and that we haven't found a body yet, but that is something that I definitely recognize and accept as a problem in terms of trying to establish whether these things exist. Now, another question that comes up is equally and as often, I think, is where are the bodies, are the questions about what they eat.
Right.
Some would say there is not enough food literally out there for a population, a breeding population, which is what we'd need, There wouldn't be enough food to support a breeding population, therefore these things do not exist.
I don't know. I think if the Micah skunk ape is real, he's having a frickin' festival eating all the pythons down there. One thing I do want to touch on in a minute, though, is the question about the bones. And you and I had a conversation a little while ago. Sorry to derail you, but I just want to throw this out there while I'm thinking about it. But we had a conversation about the finding of bones, and you were telling me something about a while back where you were having a conversation with somebody and you were talking about how they don't find the bones of like orangutans and things like that all that often. And there was a really interesting reason as to why that was. And I think it's something that's really kind of potentially very significant to the lack of an existence of some of the things that we find with Sasquatch. So anyway, go ahead, but I wanted to throw that out there.
That actually applies a little more to the fossils, but
Sure.
but it could apply to the bones too. And yeah, we will get to that. In terms of food, and this one's pretty simple. The people who say there would not be enough for Sasquatches to eat, first of all, in eyewitness reports, often the descriptions of the behaviors are they are taking branches off of deciduous growth in forests, and they're basically stripping leaves off of branches. They are eating. They appear to be not herbivorous, but probably they're omnivorous, according to the descriptions of people who claim they've seen them. Okay, nobody really knows what their feeding habits are, but again, based on descriptions, if we are to presume such a creature exists, it seems that they're opportunistic feeders. I've heard stories about seeing them running off with a whitetail over their arm. I've seen stories
Chickens, the whole
Raiding the
I think they
chickens.
just eat if they do exist. I think they eat whatever they find.
Well, now, an animal with the biomass that Sasquatch allegedly has, and again, there is this traditional view that these things are really large, but Terrestrial, who is a good friend of mine, who recently visited the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference, but she's running what's called the Sasquatch Data Project. And looking at the actual data, and she's drawing from data that's been collected for years by the Bigfoot Field Research Organization and other organizations, and she's compiling this, and she is enriching that data, and then she's doing what a statistician would do. She's looking at trends in the data. Some interesting things are coming out of that data, and in fact, I've got Terrestrial now looking at some of the UAP data that I've been collecting from my database. Yeah, but Terrestrial had said, first of all, the descriptions of the noses of these creatures are very different from what I think our common idea of what an ape-like nose would look like, which might suggest that some of these creatures do have somewhat more human-like characteristics based, again, on eyewitness descriptions. But she also says they may not be quite as large as we make them out to be. The actual descriptions of the height and the size of the creatures sometimes tends to be on the smaller side compared to our idea of this 7 or 8 foot tall monster running around out there. And so yet again, if we're talking more in the range of maybe 5.5 to 7 feet tall as opposed to 8 or 9 feet tall.
Down here in western North Carolina, the size of our deer are different than the size of the deer in Ohio.
Yes, the size of our bear are different than the size of beer.
You don't even want to get it started on the size of beer down here, baby.
Again, the largest bear species in North America, they exist at the northernmost latitudes. The largest cervid species, deer, elk, moose, they exist at the northernmost latitudes. There's a reason for that. To exist in a colder, harsher environment, you have to have the biomass to sustain the warmth. And then there's actually an idea behind this. It's called Bergman's rule, where the muscle mass and the biomass that you carry, the fat, your overall size, if you've got more mass, then that means that there's less surface area in comparison to the interior mass that you carry, and you're able to retain heat better. So to be able to survive in very cold and very harsh environments like the Pacific Northwest is certain times of the year, Bergman's rule would apply. And in fact, every other animal species we see in that region, it typically does. So Sasquatch seems to be, in that region at least, consistent with what we see from other species. But again, on the subject of food, if some Sasquatch are not necessarily as large as traditional, attitudes, myth, or whatever, conventional myth and ideas about Sasquatch in popular media depicted as being, first of all, it may not have as much biomass it has to sustain. It has enough to be able to survive in those environments. But look at all the other large, extremely large animals. Quite literally, the equivalent of modern North American megafauna that live in those regions. People say Sasquatch couldn't live there, but the moose do, the Kodiak bear do, the grizzly bears do, the elk do. All those animals do in extremely harsh environments. They find a way. They are able to subsist. Now, again, you look at the stories. Well, if Sasquatch is able to find enough food, what does it eat? Going all the way back to the indigenous American traditional legends. You know, when the salmon runs happen every year, they would always say the men would always watch their nets because these creatures, the Siatics or whatever the various names were for them, they would come down and steal the salmon from men's nets. They would be encountered out there on the beaches because they would go and dig for clams. So, I mean, these descriptions, these first two right here I'm giving you, in addition to them maybe picking leaves off branches and things, which keep in mind there are extant great apes that are very large. They have a large biomass, gorillas, and they subsist entirely off vegetation. Sasquatch, however, is described as eating high protein, high lipid, high fat food sources that are going to sustain that kind of energy that's required for a fairly large creature. So again, like the bear do, like the moose, like the elk, like all these other large species that find enough food, I definitely think that at very least a small population of these creatures, hypothetically, they'd be able to find plenty to eat.
Sure.
No question.
Yeah, and so the other question that comes to mind, and don't let me derail you, but I have fleeting thoughts and I chase them every once in a while with this stuff. So the idea of like, you have a moose. It's a giant creature. It's got plenty of food. We see moose. We see them all the time. Why wouldn't it be the same situation for Sasquatch? And that kind of brings me to this idea of these are large bipedal hominids, potentially very similar in a DNA structure to human beings. Maybe these creatures are so incredibly like humans that they're intensely cerebral and they do not want to assimilate. They've survived for this long by being skittish.
Yeah.
By being incredibly skittish and being very wary of, you know, the industrialized world around them that's just been encroaching on their territory. There are certain points when you're even like rationalizing in your own head, like, okay, I mean, just like some of these things just kind of don't really come together why this would exist. But I think it is that our want for this to be a real thing can kind of push us in a direction. But like, I'll let you continue on whatever thought you were going down. But that's one of those thoughts to where it's like, do I sound like I'm trying to over rationalize this idea of like, they're potentially human level intelligence, but they just don't want to be bothered?
Well, there might be an argument to be made right there. And again, having already conceded that I personally, I mean, there are, depending on who you ask, I'm either too skeptical or I just completely believe. I'm actually very much in the middle. And if anything, philosophically, I try to challenge myself to always challenge myself.
Yeah.
You know, and I consider myself, I think, very balanced on these subjects. I'm more than willing to consider those skeptical conclusions, but you have to be skeptical of some of the skeptical conclusions too. Again, I'm troubled by the lack of the body, but I'm not convinced by the skeptic argument for they wouldn't have enough to eat, because I know damn good and well that other species that are even larger, in fact, than Sasquatch is presumed to be, they find plenty to eat.
Right.
Now, why don't people see them more often? Again, my colleague Matt Pruitt, who wrote a great book, it's called The Phenomenal Sasquatch, and I do highly recommend that people who'd like to get a good primer on this topic, but one that really looks at a scientific and philosophical perspective on it, maybe start with Matt's book. And then also the late Dr. John Bindernagel wrote some excellent works. His two books probably should be mandatory reading, and those would be the ones I would ask people to really start with. But Matt has made the observation at times that if we presume that Sasquatch is a descendant of a creature like the Pleistocene megafaunal Asian ape known as Gigantopithecus blacki, it could be that these creatures actually had encounters with Pleistocene-era humans or hominins. Hominins are humans and basically are near cousins like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans.
Right.
Previously, we would have said hominid, which is actually the word you use for a creature like Sasquatch.
Oh, so I'm saying, I need to be saying hominin.
Hominin now, and that's
Okay.
fairly new. In fact, if you use that with spell check, it'll try and switch it back to hominid.
Damn you, spell check!
But again, the reason why is because our understanding of especially paleoanthropology is always expanding. And so, in fact, there's now a subclass, or rather, actually, I guess it's a superclass, where I think they call it Homo juluensis, and they're trying to now say that Denisovans actually belong to that group.
Huh.
Yeah, so I mean, it's getting to be a little complex, but now Gigantopithecus would not have been a hominin, it would have been a hominoid.
Right. It was a giant gorilla. It looked
Exactly.
almost exactly like a silverback, but it kind of went between bipedal and quadrupedal.
Gorillas do too, but no, we don't really know. Grover Krantz, who was one of the biggest, and best known 20th century proponents of Sasquatch, I mean, he was a well-known anthropologist, and he would debate creationists and he would defend the scientific evolutionary position, but then he'd also say, and Sasquatch is real, and I have the biggest footprint collection in the world. And so he was, yet again, there was a bit of a kind of a dichotomy there. But Krantz, of course, had tried to argue that based on the jaw structure, because we don't have much more than just the jaw and some teeth of Gigantopithecus.
Yeah.
But based, he said, on the width of the jaw, he said that would have allowed for the trachea to pass up through that jaw width, and therefore he believed that the creature was probably bipedal.
Right. Yeah. I saw a presentation that David Attenborough essentially did where they had a CG representation of what the Gigantopithecus would have looked like and the height and the scale. It's like walking down the stairs in this museum. You've probably seen that.
Yeah. I mean, think
They're
like
crazy looking.
Think like a really big orangutan that is bipedal, but I'm not so sure that Gigantopithecus was necessarily bipedal, personally.
Well, it seems to me to be able to support that weight that it wouldn't be. I think it probably had the ability to be so to go reach some food somewhere, but I think for the most part, it makes way more sense for it to walk on its knuckles a bit.
Yeah.
Before we get on another tangent, Berg, what's your brain doing with this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because there's so many different origins of theory on what the Sasquatch is in general. I mean, I think approaching it from the scientific standpoint is the most rational way to go about it. But I think I've heard everything from Sasquatch is an interdimensional creature to Sasquatch could be a tulpa created through thought projections. But I think knowing that there is actual legitimate scientific evidence and background in that almost just like piques my curiosity and definitely has me looking forward to where this discussion's headed.
Well, I would almost be willing to concede that Sasquatch, I mean, on the more skeptical side of things, if you want to call it that, could maybe be like the wild man archetype. It could be that there's this cultural awareness of human-like things, and that's where Sasquatch really emerges from. But the problem I have with that is that, frankly, in my opinion, and coming at this from a skeptical perspective, personally, that sounds a little unnecessarily metaphysical, personally. I think that to try and account for the idea that people who claim they have seen a flesh and blood, well, let's call it an animal or a creature for lack of any better determination, of what it is or way to describe it, but I mean, it is essentially human-like, albeit somewhat more feral, to say that those people have somehow manifested in their mind effectively a tulpa.
Yeah.
Right? And that they have projected a deeply embedded archetype from in the collective subconscious of humans or the collective unconscious, and that they have somehow manifested this as what they perceived erroneously as a physical experience. I mean, that to me strains more credulity than simply saying there might be an undiscovered animal species out there.
For sure. I would agree with that.
So those who would say, as skeptics, Sasquatch is just an archetype in its mythology, and people, mistake things like black bears for all this, and you can take that to such an extreme that it actually becomes illogical, in my opinion. And to me, the better way, again, as Bender Nagel would have said, and since then I think he's taken up the mantle by borrowing this word also, my colleague Matt Pruitt would say the simplest and more parsimonious explanation is simply that people are actually seeing a species they don't recognize. But coming back to Giganto, as Matt has also argued, if those creatures in ancient times had interactions with Pleistocene era, Ice Age era hominins, humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, and let's say they were hunted. Let's say they were large, slow-moving animals and they were hunted for food.
Well, there was plenty of other species we've done that to.
Bison antiquus, which are the large megafaunal bison during the Pleistocene. We hunted the mammoth. We hunted the mastodon. We hunted, in fact, actually another creature that at times its locomotion could be bipedal at times, but the giant sloth. We literally, at White Sands National Park, we see footprints of a giant sloth followed by footprints from a human. Those ichno-fossil footprints, by the way, have now been dated to more than 20,000 years ago.
That is so crazy, man.
And we know those people were trailing a giant sloth that was walking along with a tail, but also walking on two legs. I mean, we killed those too. So the idea that we wouldn't have killed something that was also essentially human-like in shape, that, like Gigantopithecus, we probably would have if we hunted giant sloths. And if it was an intelligent enough creature, it might have been like, okay, you know what, those little naked monkeys, they try to kill us, so we're going to go way up in the mountains and stay away from them.
We're going to go figure out our own way to stay away from them. And then potentially, because I just seem to find it more clearly every time that these are 100% nomadic creatures. And whether they started out that way or became that way, if these did exist at one point, I feel like, the industrialized version of the country and then moving further and further into the territories in which they used to live in. It just seems to me that if they did live at some point and or still live, if they weren't, they became nomadic. They had to. And also different, changes in climate, food source, that whole thing, you never know. But I do think it's kind of interesting to entertain because, like Austin had mentioned before, there's been a really, really, really big shift in the perception of the idea of Sasquatch because there have been more and more people that have started to take on this idea that this thing is interdimensional. I hear a lot more talk of that than there was back when you and I were kids and we were really looking into that. There was almost no question of that when we were kids. It was, this is a flesh and blood beast. It is out there in the woods. And now this kind of idea has kind of come into the realm of possibility. There's been a lot of talk about the UFO phenomenon being an interdimensional thing, UFOs being tied to this, all that sort of thing. There's a million different ways that we could go into this. But I think that where I want to try to keep it is just the flesh and blood, boots on the ground, Sasquatch. Let's just say for the sake of conversation today, let's just look at the possibilities of Sasquatch being a flesh and blood creature. That being said, if this is something that you don't want to touch on a lot, we don't have to, Micah. But one of the things that I've found kind of interesting in the idea of this folklore aspect of it is that Sasquatch culturally has become a huge phenomenon. You see Sasquatch in every gift shop from here to Timbuktu. I mean, people love this idea. If this is a myth or people that have actually seen it, I mean, like, there's a reason, whatever. It's just maybe it's a great character that this has really caught on with people. People seem to really love the idea of Sasquatch. One thing that I always think about ever since we started doing the podcast with Ghosts in the Mountains is we always end up tumbling into this like realm of folklore. I've always found one of the things about Sasquatch that's super interesting is that it seems like every single culture around the world seems to have something that they referred to as Sasquatch. Now, in your opinion, Micah, what is the difference between in those kinds of instances? What is the difference between that and how we look at like a dragon or a leprechaun or things like that? I mean, like, how do you interpret that? Because there does seem to be a lot of written interpretation of something described as a Sasquatch.
Yeah, and you have to be careful about that. The first thing is I have done a deep dive into history, and I've looked back to, going back at least as far as, the Akkadian Empire and,
I don't even know what that is.
Okay, well, so when let's just talk about the early civilizations that rise in the Middle East, and of course, when we have the rise of civilizations like the Akkadian Empire, and we have, of course, the Egyptian Empire, we have the Greeks. We, of course, have traditional epic narratives that begin to appear as well. And one of the earliest that discusses again, what we might call wild man archetype is the Epic of Gilgamesh, right?
Enkidu.
And you have, you have Enkidu, who, again, is not explicitly described as being Sasquatch like per se. The way he is described is, this wild man who runs and hangs around this water hole and everything, and he likes to jostle with the gazelles and the animals and stuff. And there's a guy who goes up there and he sees this wild man, and it terrifies him, and he comes back down. And so they end up, of course, sending, a woman to go and tame him, and he becomes the, companion of Gilgamesh. The way that that's sort of described, and really it's probably more of an allegory, what scholars interpret Enkidu to mean is he represents basically embodiment of the wild world and everything, and the dichotomy between the wild existence versus civilization and humans coming to exist in, groups and building, megastructures, first buildings, but then entire cities, harnessing the ability of fertilizing crops and thereby, of course, having agriculture. Man comes out of the wilderness and becomes civilized. And so there's sort of a narrative there, or one might interpret it as being that dichotomy between man's primal existence, i.e. through Enkidu, and Gilgamesh. Now, the more literalist interpretation might be that there was literally a wild man and that people were scared of him, and he ends up being domesticated by laying with a beautiful woman for several days.
Hootenanny. Oh wait, sorry, I'm stuck on this boojum stuff.
Yeah, and then he but see, isn't that just another trope
recurring
that
archetypes.
continues to
Yeah.
manifest?
That is
Yeah.
exactly what I was going to bring
Yeah.
up. Here you have this tale of the wild woolly man, the boojum, and this, woman that has like essentially, tamed the wild man and all that.
And sometimes it goes
Did
the
this
other
dude
way.
literally just rip off the Epic of Gilgamesh?
Yeah, he may have, and sometimes it goes the other way. Often another trope is that the wild man kidnaps the woman, and he
Well,
tries
I think
to bring
that's part of it too.
Yeah,
her back to
little
his
bit.
domain. So
A little bit of Donkey Kong going on there too.
yeah, well,
And that's where Mario comes in.
well, that of course drawing from King Kong. But I mean, do you think for a minute that concept yet again is not just another archetype
Yeah.
playing out? Fast forward to around 250 BC. I mean, I pick up there in China where I start finding some very interesting descriptions of the so-called Ye Ren, again just wild man, that begin to appear in the Warring States period.
Was that one kind of described as being red-haired, or am I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, red-haired, and again, there was an ancient. I actually had to transcribe this in these days with transcription technology, software, and things. It's easy to do, but I was able to actually transcribe a number of historic reports from the Hubei province and regions of China that describe fascinating things. One popular folk tale, again, if we want to call it that, was it said that in Dongcheng County, that there were these things up in the mountains, and that the loggers would go up and see them, and that they were in the shape of a human, but that they and they weren't described as being taller than people. They were about the size of a human, but that they were covered all over with hair that was about 5 inches long and dangled off their limbs. And one night, a group of loggers were up there and they're camping, and as their fires were burning down, one of them woke up and looked, and he saw that these things had come out of the forest, and that they had brought like crustaceans, like crayfish and things from the creeks, and had put them on the rocks by the fire to cook them. And the guy was freaked out, and he shouted, and the creatures ran off into the forest, and they left their little children sitting around the forest, and the little ones were freaking out, and so they're like, "What in the heck's going on?" And they said they hear this whistling coming out of the forest around them, and all of a sudden they start getting pelted with stones.
Oh, shit.
Now, it's remarkably similar to modern narratives about, Sasquatch whistles. And again, this is also something that's represented in indigenous American traditions with Zonqua. Zonqua is this version of Sasquatch that's seen in Pacific Northwestern American Indian or indigenous traditions. And she's often shown depicted either on masks or on, totem poles and other kinds of carvings as having pursed lips because she's whistling. And that's because those indigenous groups associated a whistle coming from the forest as being the coming of Zonqua. Zonqua was, could be identified by her whistle. And more broadly, the creatures she was associated with, large, hairy hominoids, they were described as being whistlers. And again, another characteristic associated with them, they throw rocks at people or they throw other objects. So I'm looking at this account from I guess about 1,500 years ago, from Dongcheng County in Hubei province in China, where they're describing something remarkably similar. To this day, you can go and there is Yeren Cave right there, and it literally has Yeren, the two words, painted at the top of the stone, that hangs over the cave and everything. And this cave is traditionally named after Yeren, as it's known. Now, Cliff Barrickman, who is one of the stars of the show Finding Bigfoot, talked to me about going over there. I told him all this, and he said, "This is fascinating. I'd never heard these historic accounts." Nobody had, because I found these myself. Digging into the literature, looking through folklore, looking at very obscure medicine books, that had been written, poetry also, famous poets, who had documented stories of ogres in the mountains and things. But going through and translating some of these, you find some remarkable descriptions that are very good fits for Sasquatch. Now, you also have to be careful, because when you go and you look at ancient accounts from different parts of the world, and you start looking for signs of something like a Sasquatch, my whole intent had been, so are there evidences of these things in the historic record? Because yet again, the skeptics would say, well, we don't have a body. That's a pretty good argument. They wouldn't have enough food. I'm like, well, I don't buy that at all. They'd have plenty to eat. But another of their arguments is, but there's not a historic record. These things just spring to life in the 1920s and 50s, like I mentioned earlier. The whole purpose of going back and looking specifically in Eurasia, the Pacific Northwest, and then through parts of North America for a historic record for these creatures is, well, is there actually a historic record of a very elusive kind of animal, maybe one that's so strange that sometimes people describe it as being a human, others describe it as a monster, But scholars have essentially, because of the ambiguity of the description, they've overlooked the historic record for these things. Is there one that has essentially remained hidden? I would argue that, yeah, there is a hidden history that describes hominoid encounters, but then there are also the unfortunate traveler's tales where sometimes people, when they encounter other people from, distant cultures, they dehumanize them. They describe them as being hairy beasts and things, and it's very unfortunate. There are the eager cryptozoologists, or hominologists who go back and look at some of those accounts, and you have to look for certain, contextual clues that are either evidence of the dehumanization of foreign people.
I mean, that's a very good thing to bring up. Austin, were you going to?
Yeah, I was just going to say the similarities between that story with the whistling, the rock throwing, I mean, that even goes back to what you were alluding to is when some of these stories in the 1920s start to pop up, like the Ape Canyon story. It almost mirrors that in my mind.
Yeah, it does. And that's another important thing, too. I mean, there's so much more that could be said about the history. I mean,
real quick, if you don't mind, one thing that I thought was kind of interesting about that being something that was taking place in China is kind of like their cultural relevance to the monkey in general. Because number one of their biggest folklore is Journey to the West, where the Monkey King is like going on this incredible mystical quest. There's a lot of really interesting species of monkey in China. And I'm not trying to say that folklore is explaining everything. And I'm not saying that the idea that Sasquatch came out of the lore of something like Journey from the West and whatever those like ancient mythology things were. I think the question that I would put forth is, was there something there that spawned that mythology?
Well, again, so this brings us to paleoanthropology, and I just want to talk for a second about this aspect and then carry that over into the indigenous American traditions, because what do we have in parts of, all throughout Asia? We have a few things, intriguingly. We have Neanderthals, we have Denisovans, and the Denisovans and their dispersal was specifically more so throughout Eurasia, whereas the Neanderthal had gone, they were there as well, but they also had gone further west and were present in parts of, Europe and even the British Isles. Fascinating, I think was, I'm trying to remember which of those ancient early English traditional narratives it was. I'd have to look it up, but it describes about how when the first people arrive in England, they were describing it as the land of ogres, because when they arrived, there were ogres that already populated the landscape, and it's a fascinating concept. And there've actually been modern not physics, but modern fiction books written about this. What if some of the early Homo sapiens who migrate out of Africa around 55,000 years ago, and they begin to disperse throughout, Europe and into Asia? What if, as they do that, they encounter other hominins, Neanderthals and Denisovans, and when the first people who arrive in the British Isles, they get there and they find out there are already people here and they don't quite look like us. And in those traditions, right?
Sure.
We still hear the land of the ogres. What they're actually talking about is maybe an early encounter between Homo sapiens and another kind of a hominin, or maybe some other kind of a something that we, haven't identified yet.
Well, dude, when we've done episodes talking about like the legend of Judaculla, Judaculla is not described as just this giant dude. He's like 7 feet tall. I think, with the average height, and especially like way back in the day, if you look at football players, how tall they were compared to NFL players now.
Yeah.
I'm talking about football players when the sport essentially began.
Yeah.
They were so much smaller. And so look at old doors. People were just smaller back in the day. So you have these certain genetic things that are just making people taller in certain ways.
Some people
That's
were
what
smaller.
I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Not everybody.
When Europeans, who had pretty poor diets, during the Age of Discovery were coming to America, and they first meet, representatives of, the Taino,
right,
down in the islands, or they make it to what is, North America proper now, and they would have encountered maybe some of the Seminoles. I mean, some of them were described as being 7 feet tall.
Sure. Well, that's the thing. Is like you come from over here where the average person you see is, 5'6", and then you go someplace else and you see a 6.5 foot tall person. You're going to go, holy shit, that's an actual giant. Don't go to that island over there. There's giants there.
Yeah.
I always remember hearing the story about there's giants in Iraq.
Well,
I've seen some people from Iraq that are very, very tall.
Yep.
Some people that are actually, they have gigantism. They're big people, like Robert Wadlow, I think his name was.
Yeah, Robert Wadlow was the Guinness World Record holder, and he actually was 8'11" tall, not quite 9 feet tall.
Right.
Okay.
But he suffered from, again, that pituitary gland disorder, pituitary growth disorder. I guess that was acromegaly. And again, I've looked at like the whole giant skeleton thing too over the years, and it's become controversial for a few people, even though I've never.
The Smithsonian are stealing.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I've been fascinated by that folklore too, but I've never made a claim that there are people taller than 9 feet. And frankly, all the evidence points to the quote unquote giants simply being people who have acromegaly. And I've been, called a giantologist and a bunch of nonsense just for pointing this out, because I'm interested in that mythology.
Sure.
I'm not making any kind of claim that there was a lost race of giants or that these were Sasquatch remains.
Yeah.
I'm well aware of the fact that large human crania sometimes are not indicative of the full body size of the person, because the cranium itself may be, the individual may have suffered from macrocephaly or something along those lines.
Sure.
Hydrocephaly, water on the brain would be a conventional term for this. For instance, the famous Star Child skull?
Yeah.
I've held that.
Wow.
I mean, I've got photographs of me holding that, and it's clearly a macrocephalous human skull, and also the presumed mother, which was a completely normal human skull. I've actually held the actual parent that was found alongside that skull in the cave in Mexico where it was retrieved from. Again, morphologically, those are purely human. It's not a little alien skull.
Sure.
But again, this is the difference between people who see something that they don't identify as being human because it looks different from what they know, versus a person who has a very, and like me, I've dug through all the different pathologies and things, and I know the kinds of pathologies that can cause these different morphological, appearances. It's not something inhuman. It is a human who suffers from a pathology.
Right. And I do think that is a really, really interesting point. I mean, like, genetically, there are all kinds of different things that, will shape human bodies. Any kind of different things. We have progeria. That is something that drastically changes what the average size of a human body would be and look like.
Finger count as well.
Sure. There's
rapid aging.
Yeah. There's all kinds of different things like that. And I think that it's really interesting to look at the older reports and how people way back in the day would have potentially interpreted these things.
To just kind of tie things up here, let me just make a couple of points. When it comes to the Eurasian hominin mystery, we didn't know that Denisovans existed until a few years ago, right? And I often say to people, we didn't know that there were Denisovans until there were Denisovans. There was a really fascinating book put out by an archaeologist named Myra Shackley back in the 1980s called Still Living, Yeti, Sasquatch, and the Neanderthal Enigma. And she tried to argue that obviously there might have been an undiscovered hominoid that could be the Sasquatch, but in the Eurasian narratives involving what are known as almusti, these alleged hominoid type creatures that exist in the Caucasia or the Caucasus Mountains, I guess the Caucasus, she had said that the descriptions of these were much more like people, and she was like, what if there are relict Neanderthals that are still around, and there might be some Neanderthals that even modern humans have encountered. And so fascinating argument that she makes for that. And then she goes through the Middle Ages and looks at the wild man stories and things along these lines and says, are these depictions of Neanderthals that might have survived? Yet again, that reference to, the early English narratives in the land of the ogres. I strongly suspect that could be that there were early arrivals in that land and they found some other kind of a hominin there.
That's kind of always where my mind went with it. I mean, they're always described as looking so close to humans as they are now. It's like, this could have literally just been essentially a genetic brother or sister.
Yeah, I mean, Neanderthals were morphologically different. I mean, their skull and other characteristics of their body were different, distinctively different from humans. But
close enough.
Close enough that if you saw one today, you'd be like, man, that guy looked really weird. But you wouldn't be like, that was some sort of a strange alien. I mean, they look like a human. They look like
the Geico commercials, right?
And presumably Denisovans look like humans too. But see, we didn't know that Denisovans even existed until the discoveries at the type site Denisova Cave.
Sure.
Now we are starting to find more and more remains of Denisovans, and a fascinating thing happened only within the last few weeks. Actually, going back about a decade, this anomalous jawbone was pulled out of the Penghu Channel off the coast of Taiwan, and they didn't know what it was. They were like, this is some kind of a hominin, but I mean, this looks extremely robust, and we don't know what exactly this thing is, but I mean, this either existed, 100,000 years ago, or it might have been something that existed as recently as 10,000 years ago. We just don't know. So that was called Penghu 1. And I was fascinated with this because, I mean, there were some really interesting things about this jawbone that they'd found. They weren't able to extract DNA from it to determine what it was, but now more recent testing with blood protein analysis has now confirmed Penghu 1 is Denisovan.
What is Colossal Labs going to do now?
Yeah, Ben. Well, Ben, so my friend Ben Lamb, the guy who brought back the dire wolves, actually they're genetically,
a genetic variant of a dire wolf.
They used CRISPR basically to edit the genes of existent wolves and basically match what they were able to sequence from the genome of the dire wolf. Because there wasn't usable DNA that they could extract from those dire wolves, but they could certainly sequence the genome. And to their credit, Colossal did more with that than any other science lab has done with sequencing that genome.
I watched their whole presentation on it. It's pretty wild.
But I mean, and again, because I know Ben and also we reported that story at the debrief, he reached out to me and gave me a briefing on that before the story broke. And when I first saw Romulus and Remus, the first two dire wolves, I mean, the hair stood up on my arms.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's, whether it is a direct one-to-one clone of what a dire wolf would have been back in the day, that is regardless of how remarkable this is.
The first thing I said to him on that call was, I said, well, now we got to bring back Gigantopithecus. And he says, well, we don't have enough genetic information.
Let's start with the giant sloth. Hey, how about this, guys? Let's take a quick 5. We'll come back for another 15. We'll wrap it up. Is that cool?
Sure.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for tuning in live to Ghosts in the Mountains, and by that I mean you're not. But thank you for listening to Ghosts in the Mountains. We are here with Micah Hanks talking about the possible evidence of Bigfoot. We will be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back to our exciting episode of Ghosts in the Mountains. We are joined by the great, the wonderful, my brother, Micah Hanks, a man that has done way more research about Bigfoot and the Sasquatch phenomenon than, well, the average bear. And God, dude, on the break, we were just taking a second to talk about some of this stuff, and all these other things are popping up. So we could go on for many, many episodes about all of the different aspects of the Sasquatch phenomenon, but we're going to try to keep this as concise as we possibly can. So, Brother Micah, before the break, where the hell even were we?
Well, we were talking a good bit about the idea that there were probably encounters between Homo sapiens sapiens as they leave Africa and they meet various other hominins as they disperse into Europe and Asia. And also those ancient Chinese encounters that describe what are remarkably similar to descriptions of Sasquatch. Now, my whole premise here is simply this. First of all, if humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, again, anatomically modern humans, could make their way across from Eurasia and over into North America. And furthermore, there's this aversion that anthropologists have had for a long time. And again, I'm not disparaging anthropologists. The anthropologists of today are the very ones who look back at their forebears from past decades and go, God, what were people thinking? There was an aversion to the idea that, early humans used watercraft. There is some evidence that suggests that maybe even going all the way back to, Homo erectus, that there was use of watercraft. Probably Neanderthals and Denisovans, had the capability to use those kinds of tools and to create those kinds of things so that they could make their way from major land masses to areas like, Australia. And it's not impossible that anatomically modern humans were not just crossing a land bridge to get over from Eurasia over into North America. They might also have sailed. But it's probably a tenable argument, again, and the leading premise for years really has been that at some point toward the end of the Pleistocene, as the Laurentide ice sheet begins to recede and temperatures are warming as we enter the Holocene, that there was a temporary period where sea level had not risen enough that the land bridge that existed between Eurasia and North America was put underwater as it is now.
Sure.
And so what is now the Bering Strait was the Bering Land Bridge, and it's presumed that during that period when there was an ice-free corridor but nonetheless land was exposed, humans came across that. And initially that was the first arrival of humans, was during that narrow window where we had a landmass that people could walk across. People might have traveled across ice. People might have sailed and bounced along it. But if there was an ice-free corridor and humans and animals could pass, I mean, again, if anything like Sasquatch existed in that region of Eurasia, they too could have come across. They too could have migrated.
What did they eat when they were on the ice? Seals.
I mean, the very rich, blubber-filled animals that are high in fat that would have sustained a creature and provided power to move it across that journey. But again, it's not a journey like where they're standing in the middle of Eurasia one day and go, well, today's the day. We don't know why, but something is compelling us to head north.
Honey, I need to migrate.
No, that's the whole premise. There are these ridiculous, romantic images that show people carrying spears and covered in animal pelts, and they're all moving in teams traveling across the bridge. No, they weren't traveling. They weren't migrating. They were not migrating. They were following subsistence patterns that, again, where's the food? Look, there's a bunch of blubber-filled animals that live up there along the ice. Let's just go hunt up there. Oh, cool, there's some more over there. Oh, there's some more over there. And they just keep going and going and going. And eventually they find their way into a new land, but they're not thinking we have migrated into a new world.
Yeah.
These people, and any animals that did the same thing, they were probably just following subsistence patterns. Now, the interesting thing is, what is the geographic, ground zero for Sasquatch? I mean, the Pacific Northwest, which is
Bluff Creek, baby.
Well, I mean, that is a little further down the coast.
Yeah, it's still there.
Close enough.
The modern origin of Sasquatch, though, really starts first. We have, and I guess it was 1920, right, with that article that appeared in Maclean's magazine introducing British Columbia's hairy giants by J.W. Burns, who was a Canadian government agent who worked on the Chehalis Reservation. And the skeptics have said, yes, but J.W. Burns only described large Indians. They were described as gigantic humans. If you go back and you read the article, there's a very compelling description provided by one of the sources for Mr. Burns' article, a guy by the name of, I think they refer to him as W.M. Point in that article, but his name was William Point. And William Point was named and also elaborated on this story in other periodicals that appeared in years later. But anyway, in that original letter he wrote to J.W. Burns, he and his girlfriend at the time were at a picnic up in Agassiz, and he says that as they were out there, they were walking down a railroad track near where the picnic was going on, and he says he sees a very large fellow coming down the railroad track toward he and his girlfriend. And initially, they kind of thought it was a bear. They thought it might have been a human. They were sure it was a human because whatever it was walking upright, but he says as it got closer and closer, this thing was huge. And they quickly realized it was no average human. They said that it was covered all over its body in hair like a bear is, but that its face was essentially bare. It had a flat nose that covered half of its face, a very wide mouth, and the arms dangled all the way down to its knees. And they were very frightened by this, but they thought it was one of those creatures, which again, none of the indigenous groups called these things Sasquatch. There was a word Saskateel, I think. Sasket was another version. J.W. Burns kind of bastardized all that. He anglicized it and created that term Sasquatch himself. But clearly some of the descriptions that appeared even in the Burns narrative describe the hirsute, very large, ape-like characteristics that are commonly associated with these things these days. So, now, funny enough, there was this book written a few years ago, and I have no, antagonism that I'm trying to project toward anybody, but there was this book called Abominable Science that was written a few years ago by a couple of skeptics, and they had tried to argue that there were no references to ape-like creatures that predated a sighting from 1955 on Micah Mountain in Washington involving a guy named William Rowe. The author in question of that chapter was Daniel Loxton. With the resources he had available to him at that time, in fairness, he said that he couldn't even find evidence that William Rowe existed. Not only have multiple photographs of William Rowe existed, the article he went and looked for that appeared in a certain newspaper he couldn't find, but I found it on newspapers.com, and he didn't have access to that at that time. So again, in fairness, I had more resources available to me than he did, but I was able to find the article, images of William Rowe, and more fundamental to the point, there were plenty of descriptions of large, hairy, bipedal creatures that essentially had ape-like characteristics that predated the 1955 sighting by William Rowe. Fundamentally important here, Ape Canyon.
Yeah.
People have often heard of Ape Canyon. Again, 1920s, right there, Kelso, Washington, right? Those miners, and if you go back and you look at the periodicals from that time, they say tribe of ape men encountered on Mount St. Helens. It couldn't be any more explicit how they were described. So to try and rewrite the history to say that there's no history of Sasquatch it's potentially disingenuous. And again, I will afford some skeptics, if they didn't have access to the newspaper archives and they just weren't able to do a complete search, I'll afford them, some courtesy on that. But when you know of the information, as I'm putting it out there, and again, I could provide all the documentation for every bit of this, if you actually know that this information exists, and one were to still, not that somebody has done this, but I mean, some probably would, to try and still argue there's no evidence of ape-like creatures being described prior to 1955, that is intellectually dishonest.
Well, you're also just showing that you suck at researching, so...
newspaper archives are pretty...
A subscription to newspaper.com was your barrier to entry. Sorry.
Well, in defense of that individual, because, there have been some feathers ruffled, and I've had some skeptics come after me, and one who I'm even friends with had called me a doofus for pointing all this out. And I'm like, now... How
does that make you the doofus? You were the guy that showed all this shit was real.
That would be a really good question. But again... yeah, try to figure that one out. But
doofus, you made this guy look like a dumbass because he was.
I mean, yeah, but I still try to afford those people courtesy and understand that, again, they didn't have those resources available to them at that time. And some of those very same skeptics who said that have come back since and said, man, I didn't mean that, and you're a really good researcher.
I found out you were right, and now I feel stupid too.
Well, but the truth is, I'm not trying to, and I get accused of this all the time. You're just a Sasquatch believer. You believe in ghosts and ESP. You ask certain Wikipedia editors, and they'll tell you all this. And I know they listen to your...
we were sourced.
They listen to your podcast, too, I'll just say so.
Well, good for them. They're getting some good quality content.
So for those Wikipedia editors who are listening, let me just say, I actually consider myself fairly skeptical, and I try to balance myself. But when I don't try to make extraordinary claims, what I simply try to do is I observe what the actual data says. And if I see a skeptical claim that is in avoidance of data, and I can establish that that is an incorrect statement, I try to do it. And yet, the skeptical response is he's a dumbass.
We kind of live in a very volatile era of information, and some people just make it their point in life to make sure that if anybody is going outside of the narrative that they believe to be true, then, we got to take this guy out.
So, again, this is the thing. This is part of the reason why I've looked at the paleoanthropological record. I've tried to say, let's first look at like Neanderthals, Denisovans, where they went, what they did. And again, I would leave open the possibility based on some very intriguing early cultural memories passed down by indigenous American groups that maybe some of those other hominins, non-human hominins, they may have actually made their way to North America too. But where are the bones? Where are the fossils? So you asked about this earlier.
Yeah.
Well, in those very rich acidic soils of the Pacific Northwest, it's not conducive to fossil formation. Did you know that up until maybe fairly recently, we didn't even have any fossils of chimpanzees? And they are an extant ape species on Earth today.
That's exactly the point that I wanted you to make on this podcast.
Biologists will tell you, in fact, that roughly of all the animals that have ever existed on planet Earth throughout the history of this planet, about maybe 20 to 30%, if even that, have actually been found in the fossil record. Not all animals that have existed on this planet, in fact, the vast majority of animals that have come and gone in the geological history of this planet, they don't exist in situations that are conducive to fossil formation, and yet we're trying to base our whole expectation about the kinds of animals that can exist and have existed on only what we find in the fossil record. The fossil record is not a clear indication of the diversity of biota that has existed on this planet throughout history.
Real quick, let me just say that when you first brought that to my attention, that was something that I would not have just found on my own. It's not something that I would know. I do not think that a vast majority of people understand that that is a thing.
Well, they simply don't know. And again, this is no different from a skeptic not having access to newspapers.com.
Exactly. It's not a thing of you guys just don't get it because
people just don't know.
People just don't know. It's not a superiority thing.
Yes,
it's just a freaking information thing.
So we simply have to have the discussions and say, well, listen, here's something you may not know. Now, something else people might not know. because I was so compelled by all this data, and I, again, took the path of the damned, as Charles Fort would have called it, the damned data. As Charles Fort, right? He was the early 20th century.
Micah, it's spelled 14.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
I'm referencing a comment Micah got.
This is funny.
He was writing an article and he spoke about Fortean, as in Charles Fort Associated.
Yeah.
And somebody went, it's spelled 14, like the number.
Yeah, people in their infinite wisdom correcting my spelling.
Insane, dude. So great.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we're kind of winding down, though, having looked at all this stuff, and again, I love having conversations with people where I can say, maybe here are some things, maybe you don't know about this topic. And again, whether or not this is enough to cause you to think that there is a reality to Sasquatch, that's up to you. I'm not going to try and make somebody believe this. I'm just going to say there are aspects of this that are generally not discussed in popular, both pro-Sasquatch and also both, skeptical commentaries about this. But in terms of trying to establish authoritative sources where information about this might be found, that eventually through paleoanthropology and through historical research and through biological resources available online and in labs and in museums, it finally also led me to start using the Freedom of Information Act and Public Records Act requests to try and appeal to government agencies about these things. I mean, long story short, California Fish and Wildlife got back with me. They were very kind. I'd heard that they had a file. I initially filed a FOIA request. They said they couldn't find anything. I got more specific, and you have to be specific when you file these requests, and they did send me about a 70-page document that they've been keeping on Sasquatch. And even though most of the documentation describes it in very skeptical terms, it's clear that they kept a file on this and they were interested enough in the reports they were getting that they kept a file.
Is this the one that has the map in it where they'd kind of marked off sightings that had occurred?
I think I have to look. I'm not sure if there's a map. It's mostly just correspondences, newspaper clippings, and reports and analyses, and a lot of it very skeptical, again. Mm-hmm. Now, I've also managed to get some reports that were filled out by park rangers involving sightings. There was one that I think occurred in Olympic National Park. I tracked down the ranger who actually filled out that report, and she told me, yeah, I filled that out, and there were other sightings up there around that area where that report was filled out. I got that report, which is an official government incident report, filled out where the names are all redacted, but the name of the officer, the park ranger who filled it out, her name was still on that. I won't disclose that right now, but again, I did communicate with her, and she was very helpful. There's the Dennis Lloyd Martin disappearance, which many people attribute to Sasquatch. I can tell you that I've found no evidence of that, and I've probably filed, with respect to the people who've done incredible work with that, and I know most of them. David Paulides, who Caleb, you and I saw out at Phenomicon last year, we'll see again this year.
I'm a massive fan of David Paulides' work. I think it was especially cool for, him to compliment you on your guitar playing.
Yeah.
Apparently he plays guitar too, which is super awesome.
Yeah, and Mike Bouchard, who's a Connecticut-based former cop who's also looked into the Dennis Martin case, and Mike and I have been friends for years. A lot of these researchers don't tend to get along. I tend to get along with everybody because, again, I'm not ideological about it. I'm not trying to drive a narrative.
Yeah, you're looking for the facts, man.
I'm just looking for the facts.
You are not a true believer, and that's the thing. I don't think any of us are, but we are willing to look into this stuff. But I tell you, one of the things that was kind of pushing me in the direction of wanting to be a true believer. But one of the things that pushed me in that direction was when you started telling me about some stories that you heard from park rangers up at the Yellowstone Thoroughfare. I think this is one of the most fascinating firsthand experiences I've ever heard. If you do not mind, please go in.
It actually started really with, I was canvassing several national parks, filing FOIA requests, and often I would file a FOIA request and the park would say, we don't have anything about this. But I would know that, for instance, the park naturalist at, Crater Lake National Park, for instance, had a sighting back in the 70s. Lo and behold, I ended up getting in touch with him. He's retired now and, living in a different state, but he sent me a lengthy email and explained all about what he saw. And so I began to learn that even though the FOIA process does sometimes get you some access to files like what I got from California and some other states, the best thing to do is to find a person who's a witness and track them down. And if they were a government employee in their line of work, just ask them what they saw. You'll get the information much more quickly like that. Well, Yellowstone National Park is a very interesting case because we have the oldest national park, one of the oldest national parks. I think it's actually the first one that was designated officially as a national park, and it's a massive tract of land. And the thoroughfare that you're referring to there, Caleb, is the largest expanse of wilderness where there are no roads in the contiguous 48. Or I shouldn't say there are no roads, but you can get the furthest from a road in the forest there in the thoroughfare of anywhere you can go in the contiguous 48. Now, out there in the thoroughfare, there are many rangers who have claimed that they've had interesting experiences. And, Butch Bach is one of these guys. He's written about his experiences as a seasonal park ranger out there. He'd had a friend, that he was having coffee with one day. And Butch had said, I saw a creature in the park that nobody believes I saw. And his friend said, oh, did you? Well, what did you see? And he says, I was out there skiing one day and I saw a little wolf pop its head up. And I went back and I told all the park rangers I saw a wolf. And they were like, nah, you didn't. You probably didn't see a wolf. It was probably a fox or a coyote. But he said, I know exactly what I saw. And his friend said, well, I believe you, Butch. And in fact, I saw a creature that nobody believes I saw either. He says, did you see a wolf too? And he says, well, no. No, he says, I was hiking in the thoroughfare and I was coming down off of Electric Peak. And he says, and I looked down in an alpine glade and I see, a hairy figure walking upright, just walking through this like field. And he said, and I couldn't believe it. And I sat there and I watched this thing as it walked straight through this field, oblivious to my presence, and it just walked off into the forest and everything. And so Butch goes, well, I believe that you believe you saw that. And he says, well, believe what you want, but I saw it and I know what it was. And I've talked to other people out there in the park who've seen similar things. Well, so the following year, Butch goes up there and he's camping with some friends of his. There's another, I think, ranger, and then there's a couple who are prolific hikers that go up in the thoroughfare, and they're going to try and make it to the top of one of these really remote peaks out there in the thoroughfare. And the night before they make their way up in the direction of this mountain, they're camping down by this river. And he says, we all were sitting there by the fire. And all of a sudden, he said, I can only describe it like this. It was a crazed Tarzan scream. Now, think about the famous, that Tarzan scream. He said, but imagine that more frantic, more frightening, more threatening. Something on the other side of the river was doing that from behind the tree line at us.
What's the famous one? The Sierra tapes?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, Sierra Sounds.
The Sierra Sounds, yeah. Ron Moorhead, yeah. So something like that is screaming at them. And he said that it terrified them all so much that they decided that what sleep they could get. He said, I don't think anybody slept. But he said, we kept the fire going all night. We took shifts. Somebody stayed up all night and we just waited. And eventually it stopped and we didn't hear it anymore. So the next morning, he said, none of us got any sleep and we were really tired. It was pre-dawn, it was light out, but the sun hadn't risen, and we were all kind of getting up and just kind of getting ready and stuff, and we were like, whatever that was, maybe we imagined it, and the damn thing does it again.
Oh, God.
And he said, and when we heard that again the next morning, he said we were all so terrified. He said we just went out and we decided we weren't going to continue this hike. We were so disturbed by what we encountered. Now, he mentioned another park ranger in the account that he gave by name, and so I reached out to this park ranger. And that gentleman called me on the phone one night. I just randomly get a phone call from an area code, and I'm like, I bet I know who this is. And I said, hello, this is Mike. And he says, yeah, Micah, this is Ranger Blank. I won't name him, but he said,
how long had it been since you knew about this person?
I probably found him maybe a couple months before that. Yeah.
It had been that long, and he just called you one night.
Yeah, because I passed along my information, and I said, I wonder if you would like to talk. And he said, yeah, we could line up a call. And so randomly one night, he just calls me.
That's hilarious.
And he said, yeah, we hear things out here in the park sometimes, and they'll never, ever admit that. But I mean, there are definitely things. And he says, one of the most interesting things was back in the 1990s, a woman had photographed what looked like a big gorilla standing in this field down there as you're going into the park. And she brought that photograph to us and left it with us at Ranger headquarters. And so we had that thing for a while. And he said, we did go down and we investigated the area where this sighting occurred and tried to determine if it was a stump or something. And he said there was nothing in the field, nothing at all. And there clearly was something in the photograph, but we just couldn't determine what it was.
What about the one that went along the tree line?
Oh, yeah, well, we'll get to that. So that's the best one.
That's what I'm talking about, dude. That's the one.
The Bigfoot Field Research Organization website has a few sightings. And when I kept hearing these stories from these park rangers, and in fact, when I continued my correspondence with Butch, he'd even said, funny thing was, after I started talking about this, a neighbor of mine said he was coming out of the park one night, and he said, and I saw a grizzly run across the road on 2 legs, and I reminded him, he said, grizzlies don't run on 2 legs. The story, though, that's probably the most interesting involves Action Jackson, a guy named Bob Jackson. He was a legendary thoroughfare park ranger who patrolled the thoroughfare on horseback for several decades. Sometime in the 1980s, he was leading a group out on horseback, and as they were coming along, his horse starts really reacting strangely to something. And he said, I thought there was a grizzly nearby because horses are extremely wary animals. And so, thinking that there's a grizzly, I'm just trying to control the horse, and I'm looking down in this alpine glade. And he says, and I look down there, down the hill, and at the edge of this little tree line, I can see a deer standing there, very alert, like it's looking. And then he says, all of a sudden, that deer just bolts and runs off. And so he said, I expected to see a grizzly come wandering out of the forest. But he says, instead, there's another little pocket of forest adjacent to the deer. And the deer had run off, and he says, and coming busting out of that, he says, is a hairy creature running on 2 legs. He said that when it ran, he says, how when we jog, we keep our arms bent at the elbow. He said this thing's arms were long and straight, and he says that they swung back and forth straight as it ran. And he said it ran extremely fast down to the edge of this clearing near where the deer had been standing, and it stopped, waited, and then he says that it took off diagonally down to the edge of another clearing, or not a clearing, but a little area of brush on either side of this glade. And he said it dawned on me what this thing was doing, and that's why I knew it wasn't a bear. I mean, obviously it's running on 2 legs, but he said a bear, if you watch a grizzly, if they see you and they try to run, they just run off in a straight line. He said this thing running on 2 legs goes from position of concealment, stops, waits, looks, waits, then bolts to the next position of concealment, runs in a zigzag down to that, stops, waits, bolts, goes to position of concealment, stops, waits, and he said it did that until it was out of sight. And I was like, okay, I have never seen an animal like that in Yellowstone. Now, he keeps collecting data from people. He said one time I was ticketing a guy who was camping in a place, and I said, by the way, you seen anything weird out here? He says, yeah, actually, I didn't hear it. I'm sorry, I didn't see it, but I heard it. There's this strange noise. And Jackson said that he actually on 2 occasions heard this thing himself, and that the second time he heard it, he said it was a long wolf-like moaning howl that would just, oh, and he said he timed the thing to 20 seconds. Yeah, so he said it was no wolf by any stretch of the imagination. He said it was a long moaning howl that just bellowed. And the second time he heard it, he was waiting for it, because when he heard it, he knew exactly what he was hearing. So he takes his watch and he times it perfectly. And everybody else was like, what is that? They were terrified. But he says that it was a remote ranger cabin that only Park Service members use, and they'd just gotten up to the cabin for the night, and this thing screams, and he starts timing, and he says, I clocked that thing at 20 seconds.
Hootenanny.
So there are a lot of stories. And then there was one more story, too, about a group of biologists that got up into a park. They were working on blight that year, but they started finding animal remains that concerned them, because they said that there were signs of a very large predator that had disarticulated portions of like a elk.
That's the best way to say killed. Disarticulated.
Well, not only just killed it, but,
dismantled.
Yeah. And they said that they got so freaked out by some of the stuff that was happening. And I never got the full story on what had bothered them so badly, but Jackson had heard that story too. And he said that these biologists, they were working up in the thoroughfare, and they kept getting so freaked out by what the stuff that they were finding that they just called it off and said, to hell with blight, we're going back. So,
man, when I think about that story that you were talking about the Rangers, and they all had the fire out there, and they kept hearing that thing, there is something, I think it's certainly a, DNA encoded survival mechanism. When you hear an animal make a guttural noise or something, that you can feel like almost just the power of that thing. I've had a couple of close encounters with bears here and there. I remember, growing up, Micah, you and I grew up in the woods, and came around the corner of our parents' house one evening because there were some raccoons or something getting into the trash consistently, and I heard some movement back around the side of the house. So I was like, I'm going to go scare them off real quick. So I ran around the corner of the house, and it just happened to be a bear. And as I came around the corner of the house, that thing just let out this kind of low guttural thing, and I swear I felt the ground shake when that happened.
Probably actually, tell you the truth, a subsonic component to that, or a
Sure.
or an ultrasonic something.
No doubt. I mean, but imagine here you are out in this remote area. You're familiar with most large, mammal calls that would be around that area. And here's this thing, you have no clue what it is. It is going on that long, and you can tell that whatever this thing is, it's got a massive lung capacity. Dude, that has got to be so harrowing.
Oh, yeah. Well, the other thing, too, is, again, based on the descriptions that these park rangers gave me, I mean, it's clear to me that these guys are very good observers. They're trained wildlife watchers. They are aware of what kinds of animals exist and what kinds of sounds are associated with them.
100%.
The skeptic would say either one of two things. Well, these are fascinating stories. Or they would say, but where's the body? Where's the evidence? Those are very easy things to say at the end of the day. And again, I'm going to say that with knowledge of all those Wikipedia editors and others who listen and who love to just, shit on all this stuff. At the end of the day, to me, it is more illogical to observe data, even if it's anecdotal like this, and completely dismiss that or discount that. And to say that, well, we have no evidence of there being something. That is more illogical, in my opinion, than to make the seemingly, in my humble opinion, non-extraordinary argument. And I'm not even saying that you have to believe this. I'm merely saying we should be open to the possibility that some of this data might represent an unknown species and that some very credible, trained observers have had very accurate, or rather, they've had encounters and they have recounted those experiences very accurately. And some of those people happen to be employees of the United States federal government. Some of those people happen to be trained wildlife experts, biologists, people who work in various different, agencies in the sciences in an official capacity. I mean, some of these people probably have a very good working knowledge of all the animals out there, and they claim that they have experienced things that are not consistent with any of those known animals. And then further, we should also stop saying, it's not fair of us to take our modern Sasquatch that only began to exist in the 1950s and project that onto indigenous American traditional beliefs. Because frankly, quite the opposite is often said by some of those indigenous American groups. They say, no, you people always try to tell us what we believe and what we can believe. And our traditions are very clear and we know exactly what they entail. And those stories describe these same creatures that modern people still say that they see. So don't tell us what our beliefs are supposed to mean and what our beliefs are supposed to, convey. We know what those beliefs are. We know what they mean. We know what we believe and we know what our traditions tell. And you're not going to explain that to us,
Yeah, and not to mention the Native American population have also been having to combat the complete bullshit whitewash, bullshit stories. Austin has uncovered a million of them since we started the podcast, not even, a year ago.
There's this incredible book that was written by an indigenous American scholar called, I believe, The Indigenous Paleolithic People of North America. And she makes the argument that, yes, basically modern anthropology has completely tried to drive this narrative that people only arrived this recently in North America. And she says people have probably been here for at least the better part of 100,000 years now. That based on indigenous traditional knowledge. And she says we have to, as anthropologists, and she also is a representative of an indigenous American group, she says we need to accept and we need to respect and we need to incorporate that corpus of knowledge into our broader knowledge. But the intriguing thing is the physical anthropological knowledge and the paleoanthropological record says that humans didn't leave Africa until 55,000 years ago. So if there were people here 100,000 years ago, as some of these traditions hold, who might they have been? Again, my premise is that we might equally find some useful data in those traditional narratives. We might find some useful data in government records, but certainly in the testimony of government officials who have on the job in recent times discovered things that they didn't think could exist, but they certainly saw it and heard it.
Sure.
There may be more data about this than some skeptics are willing to look at, and I don't think it's an extraordinary claim or an unreasonable position to say that we should at least look at that data, however crazy it might seem, and let's challenge ourselves to take it seriously and see if there is something, a biological reality that we've overlooked.
This is how I think that people should look at the nature of science. Micah, you are a damn scientist, my friend. You're looking at all of the possible evidence, and any of those assholes out there that want to look at you and say, Hanks believes in all this crazy shit. Well, you may realize that Micah came on the podcast and he talked about UFOs. Micah also came on the podcast and he talked about the possibility of ghosts at the Reynolds Mansion. Micah talks about the possibility of all of these things, but Micah never comes to the table without a substantial amount of potential evidence that leads to these theories, nor does he ever saying, I am a true believer in all of this shit. And that's the thing that I really like about you, man. And I don't think that that's a thing that's like, you're just not going to choose one side. No, you're just presenting data. And maybe that's going to lead somewhere. Maybe that's going to help us figure out what all of these things are down the line. Anybody that thinks otherwise has clearly just not listened to what the you've said.
Or done any research, maybe. But
so that being said, dudes, I wanted to get into the Patterson-Gimlin film, but we're already way over time.
We can do a whole episode about that.
Yeah, that's its own episode.
Let's do a whole episode sometime in the near future. Well, 10 episodes from now, then I guess that's when Micah
next
comes
10
around.
episodes.
I really do want to dive into that subject because that's one that I think we should do a damn breakdown of. There's just a lot with it. That being said, Micah, dude, thank you so much for talking with us about this stuff, for bringing this stuff to light, allowing me to kind of, pose some of these questions that we've talked about this, but I just don't think that these have been things that a lot of people know about. And maybe if you are a listener of Ghosts in the Mountains and you come here for the ghost content, but you're really not interested in the Sasquatch, I really genuinely hope that the information that Micah has brought to the table today has maybe at least just pointed your interest in a direction towards it, because I think it's a fascinating subject, and I don't know. I think that there's more to this whole thing than a lot of people are allowing it to be looked into. Austin, before we cap this thing off, any last thoughts?
No, I mean, I think we've really left it on a good place right here. I think that the evidence has been laid out. Like you said, we presented the data. Everyone else can make their own decisions from there.
Until we just... Well, we'll see. We'll see where the conversation of the Patterson-Gimlin film discussion goes, because it can go a lot of ways. I actually do have some relatively definitive opinions on it. But that being said, what I want to say to our listeners is we would actually be nothing without Micah Hanks. Micah was just instrumental in the beginning and generous enough in the beginning to just push everybody in his incredible audience our way and to say, hey, give these guys a shot. They're baby podcasters and they're planting the seeds that hopefully one day will grow into a big tree of a podcast.
Tiny little babies.
Tiny little babies. And hey, so far we have gotten an incredible reception from all of the people that have given our little podcast a chance, and thank you so much. And thank you, brother Micah. Dude, seriously, this would not really have been possible without your support, and thank you, man.
Boogeyman 733, Greengrass and High Tide, y'all.
Boogeyman 733, you're an inspiration to us all. Well, once again, thank you all for joining us on Ghosts in the Mountains. I am your host, Caleb Hanks, with my brother, Micah Hanks, and the Dr. Captain, Austin Burgess. If you want to find out more about what we do here at Ghosts in the Mountains, you can go to ghostsinthemountains.com. If you would like to support what we do, you can become a subscriber on Patreon and get an ad-free version of the podcast and some other little goodies, like when we went traipsing around the graveyard where we found some really wild stuff after our Ghost Riders of Fletcher episode. And if you want to have more content like that, please check that out. And once again, thank you so much for listening to another episode of Ghosts in the Mountains. We'll catch you guys next time. Stay spooky, everybody. All right, so follow me. I'm a Bigfoot. I'm on Mount St. Helens. Everything's going all right. Everything's going fine. I hear a little rumbling. I'm not too worried. I keep walking, going to find some food. Next thing I know, Bigfoot bodies everywhere. Did that really happen, Micah?
Burnt keister Bigfoot.
This podcast is dedicated to all the potential Bigfoot that lost their lives on Mount St. Helens. That being said, guys, we're all completely on board with the idea that Sasquatch is just a poop-covered bear coming out of hibernation, right?
Or they just jump through wormholes.
What if they are poop-covered bears that jump through wormholes?
Skinwalkers.
All right, thanks for listening to us. There's your Keister egg. Good night, everybody.